Today, our cities are flooded with illegal aliens. Americans are being squeezed out of the labor force and their jobs are taken. The Republican platform promises to launch the largest deportation operation in the history of our country.
I do think a lot of folks are unaware of immigration history.
It is a manifest right of our government to limit the number of immigrants our nation can absorb.
How complicated it is.
The big question in many minds, why Bracero?
Their scope of knowledge is what they themselves experience. There's a reason folks don't want to talk about these stories, and I think it foments these kinds of divisions.
The United States tells itself frequently that it's a nation of immigrants, usually immigrants from Europe, building those East Coast industries. The border region is seen as peripheral to the primary story of the great cities of the East.
The first immigration laws in 1790 were predicated on whiteness. That sets up a racial project for the U.S. To belong, to have a path to citizenship, is to be white.
Texas. While winter holds the north in icy grasp, these fertile fields of the warm Rio Grande Valley yield a wide variety of fresh vegetables.
Places like Texas, people go from being subjects of the Spanish crown to being Mexican, to being Texan, to being U.S. citizens. Folks on the U.S. side and Mexican side are trying to figure out where the line is going to be placed. The Rio Grande becomes an odd dividing border between these two countries. By the 1920s, we have this vernacular. Wetbacks becomes derogatory shorthand for any Mexican, including Mexican Americans. This causes a lot of tension between Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants. It collapses everyone into being brown.
The stock market crash in 1929 ushered in the greatest economic depression in the nation's history.
During the Great Depression, Mexicans were often scapegoated for the ills of a declining economy. Mexicans look unlike the Europeans that are defining the American story of immigration, and they can be easily deported to a neighboring country. Government officials rounded up Mexican people, regardless of whether they were Mexican citizens or not, and forced them to Mexico.
It doesn't matter if you were Mexican-American, multi-generation, if the border essentially crossed your family instead of you crossing the border. It becomes terribly ironic for those who have lived their entire lives in the US. Some who never really spoke Spanish tried to rebuild entire lives in a country that for them is foreign.
But when World War II happened, there was fewer and fewer people actually to work in the fields to feed the nation. And so what was arranged was for Mexican agricultural workers to come back and harvest those crops. It was known as the Bracero program.
Imagine if you were someone who had just been deported in the 1930s, and all of a sudden, it's 1942, and they're trying to recruit you into a U.S. workforce.
Down at the camp where the Mexican nationals come in to help the Americans harvest the crops, there's quite a bit of mail addressed to Americans overseas.
World War II was the impetus for the Bracero program, but when we look at how many contracts were filled, the majority of the contracts were filled afterwards.
The farmer brings his certification for Braceros to his labor recruiting association.
What that demonstrated is the owners of these agricultural enterprises really wanted a tractable labor, a labor they could expel, they could deport if those workers organized unions, for example, or questioned the conditions of their labor.
En el pueblo mío se hablaba mucho de un convenio que tenía el gobierno de México con los Estados Unidos. Lo examinaban de la boca, los ojos, del recto. Lo más humillante era que lo bañaban a uno primero con un líquido y después con un polvo para que uno no trajera ninguna infección. Pero lo que me importaba era lograr el objetivo de venir a trabajar a los Estados Unidos.
My uncle came to the U.S. through the Bracero program. Someone asked them to come in. But guess what? During the Bracero program, we saw a spike in undocumented labor because these employers learned how to use the sanctioned system and the unsanctioned system. And the reality is, if the undocumented workers heard of better jobs, they could leave. They basically were in more control of their movement than Braceros.
In the 1950s, Mexican immigrants become much more visible in cities across the country. They start to spread out beyond rural spaces.
These stories leap onto newspapers, into the cinema. We have a sense that undocumented workers are a problem.
There's also economic waves, moments of recession. Operation Wetback is born of one of those economic downturns.
To set reasonable requirements on the character and the numbers of the people who come to share our land.
The president calls his old army buddy and appoints him commissioner of the INS. He starts to unleash something that does deport people, but the more palpable reality was it fomented fear.
What the INS would do is make a show of force, a raid on a place of employment, then have newspapers broadcast this.
Here is a dramatic picture of an actual chase as the border guards nab a hitchhiking passenger in his attempt to make an illegal entry into the United States.
That would then lead to fear amongst immigrants and a self-deportation to avoid what they perceived as the coming army of INS agents.
During the Bracero program, you have this clamor for recruiting Mexicans. At the same moment, you have a large-scale deportation system framing them as problematic.
People perceived as being wetbacks would be captured, taken to the border, sent through a kind of a revolving door, and come back the other side as braceros. They'd sign them up and they'd come back. Now legitimate workers on temporary contracts. It was a process known as drying out the wets.
In the heart of rich California farmland, these workers signal a growing protest movement.
There's at least 3 fissures amongst ethnic Mexicans in the post-war period. There are the Mexican Americans who were advocating for a farm worker union, braceros that were guest workers here essentially on loan. And then there's a bunch of undocumented workers who work alongside these two groups. And there's a lot of tension amongst them.
They brought in 220 wetbacks. These are the illegals. There's no way to defend against that kind of strike breaking.
Cesar Chavez and the Mexican Americans are saying, well, I don't care if you're a bracero or an undocumented person, you're bad for our ambitions of creating a union. And so these fissures were always there.
En 65, los mismos que nos contrataban nos llevaban hasta la frontera, que si quería o no quería, tenía que regresar a México. Para entrar a Estados Unidos tuve que hacerlo entre la 1 y la medianoche. Ya estando de este lado del río, nos levantó la persona que nos transportó hasta aquí, hasta Chicago. Pues muchos nervios ni esperanzas que se comparara cuando yo era bracero.
My uncle makes his way into the cold storage industry in Chicago. He becomes a Teamster, a green card holder, a U.S. citizen, and his job allows other family members to also become card-carrying members of the union, including my own father.
Seasonal labor, willing to do this kind of work.
When the Bracero program comes to a close, we think all guest worker programs come to a close, and it is not true. Trump learns much of the work he needs in his hotels and other places can be called quote-unquote seasonal work, in which he can bring in guest workers. So all the while, you have a president saying, we need to make America great. We need jobs for Americans. Yet he himself employs guest workers.
You know who's taking the jobs that are created? Illegal aliens.
One of the biggest challenges for the Trump administration is what comes after mass deportation, because there's a disconnect between mass deportation and wages.
We have to take care of our farmers and hotels and, various places where they need the people.
These are not jobs that most Americans who are not immigrants want to have.
In a lot of ways, disdain for Mexicans is now being extended to Central Americans. And lo and behold, we have a lot of similar tension that we had within this community during other parts of American history.
Latino voters embraced Donald Trump despite his anti-immigrant rhetoric.
All the while, we see the way this tracks into our family lives, the way U.S. policy shapes real everyday people. This stuff doesn't disappear. As long as we tell these stories, we become stewards of our own histories.